Growing and scaling a tax team is no walk in the park. Where do you even start? As a tax professional, this is not a natural part of our skill set, but it is something that many tax teams are expected to do. David Francis, our guest for this episode, is responsible for the tax dispute resolution team at Grant Thornton, and he's been responsible for the team's growth for some time now. In this episode, you'll hear David's experiences and advice for growing or scaling a tax team to help you do the same. You're listening to episode 116 of the Tax Professionals podcast, the podcast that helps tax professionals with their tax careers, passing their tax exams, and becoming better tax professionals.
Welcome to the Tax Professionals podcast, the podcast dedicated to helping you improve your tax career. Here's your host, Jack Bonehill.
Hi everyone, and welcome to this episode. Since taking over the employment tax team at PK Smith Cooper, I've become more interested in how to grow and scale a tax team. This is partly for my own interest, but also because, as is the case for many accountancy firms, we're looking to grow the tax function as a whole. However, I would say that this is one of the most difficult aspects of being a tax leader. As tax professionals, we are typically not entrepreneurial by nature, even if we might like to think that we are. We are risk adverse and we're trained to be good advisors, not business people. There's so many things to deal with when growing a tax firm. Where's the work going to come from? How will we ensure high quality client service with the growing team? How will we have the right people? To share his perspective and provide some advice, we have David Francis joining us on this episode, who has been responsible for his team's growth for some time now, and he continues to be responsible for the growth. David's experiences of growing a tax team come from his time at PwC and at Grant Thornton in senior roles, and for someone in such a position, his approach and outlook might shock you. As part of talking about growth in this episode, we also touch upon David's leadership philosophy, which I think is spot on and helpful for anyone that's new to a leadership role or just wants to get better at being a leader. For rough timings on each section of the episode, head on over to the show notes at taxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP116. The show notes also contain all the links mentioned throughout this episode and include contact details for me and David if you'd like to get in touch. Coming up in May 2025 and June 2025 are my next masterclasses for tax professionals to help tax professionals improve crucial skills for working in tax. May 2025 is the next tax research masterclass, which helps tax professionals know how to find, use and apply appropriate tax legislation, guidance and case law. June 2025 is the next tax advice masterclass, which teaches tax professionals how to provide high quality tax advice that clients value and which lead to referrals and repeat client work. To grow or scale a tax team, you need highly skilled team members so that work can be spread out and completed to a high quality without needing lots of yours or other senior members' time in every single piece of work. The more work that can be delegated and spread out, the better. Both of these masterclasses will help with that. You can get further details by heading on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/masterclasses. But if you're interested in either of the masterclasses for multiple tax people in your firm or tax team, then I suggest that we have a call where I can share some more information, how we figure out if it would be beneficial for your firm or your team. If you think it would be beneficial, we can talk about who would benefit, and we can also talk about how I can best work with you and help you. Anyway, without further ado, let's get to the episode. So if you just start us off then today, Dave, can you just tell us a little bit about you and your tax career?
Yeah, sure, Jack. So I'm Dave Francis. I currently lead the tax dispute resolution team at Grant Thornton. I managed to get into tax by accident. I think it's probably the nicest way of saying it. I was always going to end up following the family tradition, which was military. My dad was in the military, my mum was in the military, my brother and sister both in the military. All the male cousins in my family are all military. And I was joining the military to the point that I jumped off something as high as a desk and my knee exploded. So I needed to think quite quickly what I was going to do for the rest of my career. And at the time, my mother-in-law had previously worked at the Inland Revenue. She said, once you get your knee fixed, actually, there is an ability to play sport for the department and get an extra week's holiday. So that's kind of how I fell into tax. I joined HMRC, or Inland Revenue as was, on their graduate scheme. Started there in 2003. Did my training, which at the time was about 6 years in total. 4 years of which were exam based and sort of going out initially to inquire into the likes of hairdressers, taxi drivers, sort of predominantly in that cash rich businesses, and then progressed on to more of the companies and larger companies and ended up in HMRC at the point they joined, which I think was about 20 years ago now, became a customer compliance manager that they just brought in for a number of the larger businesses within the Worcestershire region. I fancied a change at that point. I'd completed my courses. I was fully technically trained in terms of a grade 7, but I needed something else. And I wanted to join the fraud investigation service. That's what it's called now. It was specialist investigations back in those times. But they wanted me to join across, but didn't have the budget, despite at the time an SI inspector would bring in 30 times their salary. So it really started the seeds, I think, for me thinking about a commercial aspect. I ended up going into a role which was a pure technical role within capital gains tax. I was the technical advisor for rollover relief, incorporation relief, and land valuation. But it missed a bit that I really enjoyed, which is around the people. And because I couldn't get into the role I wanted to get into in HMRC, I started looking externally and was offered a manager role with PwC. So I joined PwC in 2011. And I think it's fair to say, Jack, it was a bit of a culture shock. And we'll talk quite a bit about culture, I think, in terms of the rest of the chat today. But whilst being warned by many people that it was definitely a different culture, it was a real struggle when I first landed. I was thrown in as a manager. I was having to deal with all the things managers deal with, but without the necessary commercial acumen that's probably required for being as part of one of the big four. And I was definitely lost for that first sort of 9 to 12 months, to the point I joined in the January, went on holiday in the August, and sort of gave myself a bit of a pep talk to say, I've got until Christmas to determine whether I go back to HMRC with my tail in my hand or I actually find a bit of a success of it. And a few things I think came along during that period. I spoke to a number of my colleagues that I was working with and my boss, and we set out a little bit of a roadmap. Effectively I came forward. I think they knew that I was struggling, but I actually opened up and sort of said, look, these are the things that I find difficult. These are the things that I feel that I'm not necessarily achieving some of the objectives that are being set. And that conversation, we agreed on a plan and a plan to get through to Christmas to see where we are. And it went well. And from that day forward, I felt like it's progressed to the point that I was made senior manager about 3 years later. I wanted to expand. I wanted to really grow my business, but didn't feel that I was able to do that whilst at PwC. So then joined Grant Thornton in 2016, came in as an associate director and have been there ever since. So coming up to 9 and a bit years, I've been there. Started off as associate director, made director in 2018, and then eventually made partner in 2021.
So actually then, it sounds to me like when you decided to leave HMRC, then that you didn't leave with the intention of, say, becoming a partner one day. It's kind of happened and evolved since leaving HMRC. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely, Jack. I think it's spot on. I think if you'd have asked the Dave Francis of 2011, he just wanted access to a different client base, almost a different opportunity to learn and grow. There was never any thought that at the point I left HMRC saying to myself that one day I'm a partner, one day I'll become a partner, should I say. I still sit here now when in 2025 and reflect and say, how have I got here? Ultimately, how is it that I am a partner in such a large organization? And there is an element of me that sits there some days and say, do you know what? They're going to find me out at some point. Jack, they're going to find me out. Like imposter syndrome definitely lurks in the background. But I think that's good for me because it keeps me grounded and keeps me in a position to think, right, how else can I develop? What else can I do? How else can I learn? But definitely was never any kind of thought from day one that partnership was where I was headed.
Yeah. I think actually kind of that humble kind of side of you and the fact you actually started in the military, actually, I think for the more senior leadership type roles has probably actually put you in a quite a unique position to do things a little bit differently to say the typical tax advisor or accountant. I'd say the approach is probably very different with your like background. You've probably seen things in a different way and been able to bring that along with you.
Yeah, I think so, Jack. And I think when I look at it, so my dad was military and we moved every 2 to 3 years. So my brother and sister got the glorious postings of places like Singapore and Malta, whereas I was Germany. And so we'd kind of flick between either Plymouth or Poole in England or a couple of places out in Germany. So it was never really the exotic climes. But what it really taught me, I think, from that position is how to fit in, how to adapt, how to kind of flex my own style, and ultimately how to try and fix things myself, and kind of thinking about how I go about things and how do I fit in if I'm not, for example, creating many friends when I've moved from one school to the next. And I think sport helped me in all of that, Jack. I played a lot of sport. I was just this morning back at the knee specialist for yet more knee operations. So I don't think it's done me very well from a health perspective, but certainly helped in my career, linked to the military, as you said.
There's a pro and con to everything, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely.
So shall we kind of go back in time a bit then? Because obviously the focus of this episode today is going to be on growing a tax team, I suppose specifically within a professional services firm, because I suppose that's pretty much what you've done since you've been at GT, maybe even a little bit before when you were at PwC. But should we kind of go back in time and kind of when did it start then when you started getting involved and started becoming responsible for growing a team? Like when was this? What did it look like? Just, I suppose, tell us everything that comes to mind.
Yeah, so go back to, it was PwC, going back to there, getting over the initial challenges in terms of adapting to the culture, adapting to what was expected. After about 18 months of being in the role, the people that were left in the Midlands had actually moved on. So I was suddenly responsible for being, I think I titled myself Head of Tax Disputes for the Midlands, a grand title that I'm not sure anybody else kind of dealt with or kind of acknowledged. But at that point, I was getting to a position where I was winning quite a bit of work, but didn't have any team to be able to deliver. So it was that kind of situation where I was in I was going out to win work, both internally, externally. I'd win the work, then I'd have to do the work. And actually my days become quite long. And that's brilliant from a point of view of personal development. I was getting access to lots of different bits of work. I was kind of getting the experience in different things, but it was never sustainable. So it would always be quite lumpy in terms of the business. You could see at what point I would become busy delivering because the opportunities would start drying up. So when I made senior manager, which was, as I say, after 3 years of being at PwC, I pushed and received a sort of a graduate to come and joined me. But at that point, the business had grown to a degree that, again, that leverage wasn't quite there. And I was always asked or tasked to sort of win or have a business of about £1 million to get to a director level at PwC at that time. But couldn't do that with the size and shape of the team that I had. So it was at that point that I started thinking about actually what is it I needed to do to grow a business that was capable of sustaining both me, but also a team underneath it, which would then kind of give me the ability to then leverage myself to go and do the stuff that I really enjoy doing, which is going to speak to prospective new clients, going to build relationships with intermediaries, and ultimately open up an avenue of work which would bring more opportunities into the team. Mm-hmm. So I had a number of discussions, and there was lots of sort of promises, but at that time at PwC, tax dispute resolution wasn't necessarily one of the key opportunities that they saw for growth. And I looked around and I could see that Grant Thornton had two partners who were coming towards the twilight of their career, and there wasn't necessarily that succession, or I couldn't see that succession from an external point of view that kind of caught my intrigue. So I had a number of conversations with a partner. We talked about potentially growing the business and how I achieve that and what I needed to do to then get beyond that and get to sort of director level. Mm-hmm. So I was responsible again for sort of the Midlands team. And at that point, we were very reliant on sort of an overspill of work from London. We were just coming out of the offshore disclosure facility world. So the the aptly named Liechtenstein disclosure facility was coming to an end. And we needed to really refocus the type of work that we're doing, so it became more of a holistic tax dispute offering. So it wasn't just offshore, it was everywhere. And I quickly expanded that team from being just the two of us at that time to a point that we had 6 people in the team, and we'd grown the revenues and we'd got to that £1 billion that sort of PwC were looking for. And everything was going rosy to the point that I was made director on the back of growing that team. But you quickly learn that ultimately we were a national team. So we had a team up in Manchester, we had a team in London, and we had about 25, 26 in terms of the number of people within the team. So we had to kind of really grow that. And at the same time, both the partners that were in the team retired, and there was a bit of a vacuum left in terms of leadership. So that was the first point. I think it was 2019, I was made the head of tax dispute resolution. And I look back and can definitely say hand on my heart, it definitely felt like a gamble from the firm to place that trust in somebody who at that point had only had sort of 9 years experience on the commercial side of things in practice, to be then taken up with leading a team at the time where the 2 main work winners had departed and there was a lot of flux within the team.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it sounds like then actually, if I'm reading between the lines right, PwC wouldn't have allowed you to have the right resources to get to the number where you could have been made a director there. So you kind of just saw that the path had almost ended in terms of progression when you decided to leave.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of I'd add into that, there hadn't been an internal promote to director at the time that I was there for a number of years at PwC. They subsequently have promoted some really good people, and they've got some really good partners that have gone on from being a director to a partner. So there's often, sometimes it's just a matter of timing. But certainly looking back at the time that I was there, I couldn't see that there was the ability to progress doing what I was doing with the support that I had.
Yeah, it's always a shame, isn't it, when that happens, I suppose. It results in probably a lot of people moving from one firm to another.
Yeah, and I'm not going to say that it was easy in the early days at Grant Thornton. I think there was a couple of times where I personally felt that the goalposts had moved, the objectives were there, and given the way that, again, sometimes there's some internal reorganizations, and at that point, you might not fit into that role. But what I've learned from my time now at Grant Thornton is actually things do come back, and you are able to try and kind of sort of maneuver yourself, and you've got to take that responsibility, really. If you see that there's an opportunity to grow something, back yourself, even if you don't necessarily have that experience, because by doing that, you're going to create the opportunities. You make mistakes, and there's no doubt that I've made mistakes along the way, but I've learned from those mistakes, and actually those mistakes were really important to the Dave Francis that's sat here talking to you now, with a view of how we go on to the next phase of where we are as a team, which is how do we grow even further? How do we grow bigger? How do we make that leap? How do we go beyond where we are in terms of the numbers now?
Yeah. So I think let's talk a little bit initially then about when you first started GT then. So did you say it was just you and someone else initially when you started GT, in your region anyway?
Yeah, it was principally me and another senior manager, and we did have some resource that were, whilst London based, they were living in the regions. So we were able to tap into some junior resource at that point. But ultimately, it was the senior manager and our responsibility to sort of almost grow that presence in the Midlands. And often I think there's a challenge for businesses, certainly that are national, when based in the Midlands, in that London isn't that far away. And you often find that some of the specialists that might be sat in London will be touting for business in there, and if you haven't got the established name or established backing, it can be quite challenging. So we quickly set about, and this is something that I've kind of really rely on, really, is set about a business plan. One thing I've learned about those business plans is they never go according to the plan that you think they will at the outset. But actually, by doing the plan itself, it's the process of thinking about what are you going to do, how are you going to do it, and then do the behaviors that really matter to get you to a position where you're able to tap into the opportunity. they're really good of actually making you accountable for doing those actions.
Mhm.
And we set out right from the outset to be sort of the number one tax dispute team that operate in the Midlands. If in truth, Jack, there wasn't many competitors at the time, so it wasn't a goal that shouldn't have been too hard to achieve. But by achieving it both in terms of size and the number of people that we had there, suddenly we had the opportunity to build and grow, and we could start talking about the opportunity, and then we can start getting into the foray of actually being able to go out and recruit externally. And that recruitment externally is the one where we've been able to incrementally grow, because the Midlands team in itself, whilst established and whilst there were some really good people in there, we just needed those people that had the experience to help us then achieve that ability to grow.
Yeah. So let's have a little talk about, I suppose, the business plan. I know, as you say, it changed and whatnot. And I'm sure you've had multiple variations over the years now, because
Yeah.
I'm sure you have essentially one for each year. So initially, then, like, I suppose at the start when you first started doing the business plan, was the primary focus on where to get the work from, or was it kind of more holistic and wired than that?
I think it's probably the latter, Jack, is in that we had to think about what is it that we could see as an opportunity. So the first thinking was, what are HMRC up to? And then trying to do a bit of crystal balling to think, what are they likely to be up to? So I sort of maintained my connections within HMRC, and some of the people who've completed the course just before I did have gone on to some really senior positions within HMRC. So using that network, we were able to kind of get an indication of the direction of travel, but also listening to statements in terms of kind of any parliament briefings, any Hansard, anything along those lines, using those as a basis to say, right, what's likely to happen? And then starting thinking about, okay, what's likely to happen? What do we need to be doing? What do we need to be saying? Who do we need to be talking to? So it was really more of that granular detail that we looked at, which was the how, not necessarily the ending point or the anything of what it might look like. It's actually, what are we doing behaviors wise that will get us in the best position then to get to a section where we can start winning some of the work. So it was always about actually, how do we tackle things? How do we get to a position? At the time, the team itself that was dealing within Grant Thornton, we were very good at dealing with offshore tax disclosure work. So we had really excellent contacts in the places like Switzerland and the Channel Islands, other places. But we didn't get a huge amount of work from the internal team. So had to then understand why, what was that? How visible were we? How often do we just go and sit with another team? How often would we talk to those other team about, this is what we're seeing from HMRC? This is kind of what we're seeing from them in terms of their actions. How does that then mean for your client? So it was always looking at what's our internal client relationships team's problems, and how could we then use that as an opportunity for us to be able to solve those problems, or at least be in a position to help them. And one particular area that we got involved in really early on was around, at that time, there was quite a lot of activity from HMRC in the avoidance space. So that then created an issue in a lot of the mergers and acquisition cases. So we were able to kind of utilize our contacts if there was some historic tax avoidance work to go in, resolve the inquiries that were underpinning it for them then from a commercial aspect to be able to resolve. So it was really about behaviors that we focused on in terms of the business plan. But linked into that, it wasn't my business plan, it was our business plan. And I've always been really keen as a team is that we do this together, because then we've all got shared responsibility for making it work. I know I've been in places where the business plan has definitely been thrust upon me to kind of do. And I never really had that engagement. I don't think I never really kind of necessarily believed it, or at least had the ability to go in and talk about what is good about that business plan, or what could be changed, or what could be different. And I felt that there was an ownership problem. So I've always been keen to kind of ask the rest of the team to find out what we should be doing. And certainly in those early stages, I was definitely more to the, let's have a big collaboration and get this right, to where I think I am now, which is a bit in the middle, getting everybody's thoughts, but actually trying to help use my experience and sort of knowledge to a position where we can move that business plan to a collective, i.e. this is our business plan, but some real focus. Certainly in
Yeah.
those early stages, I wanted to do everything. The world was our oyster. I was really keen, let's do everything. But what I realized quite quickly is we just had to make sure there was 3 to 5 things that we could do really well, and really focus on what they were.
Yeah. So in the business plan as well, then, would you have had anything in there about, like, say, the culture that you wanted to create, or like how you were going to, say, scale it in terms of revenues and, say, people, or did that kind of stay outside, at least in the beginning, or at any point? Did it ever come into that, the business
So
plan?
at the beginning, there was always a sort of £1 million target. That was kind of where we wanted to get to. So there was always that, but it didn't necessarily focus as much on the people or the culture aspect. I've learned definitely a few lessons along the way around culture, and my team are probably bored for me opening with slides when we have our team presentation, which is a great phrase for, and I forget the name, I think it's Peter Drucker, which is culture eats strategy for breakfast. And it's so true. You can have a brilliant strategy, but if your team are not invested, you're not going to get to a position of actually where you want to be. So culture is really important. It's really important to me. And that's probably born out of a couple of experiences, sort of that challenging point I had at PwC when I first started my career. There were some really poor examples of behavior that I went through, including at one point having my work ripped up in front of me and being told that's what I think of that. I reflect back and I'm glad I went through that experience, because it drove me on to actually achieve where I wanted to do. But I would, I can't even begin to explain how I'd react, I think, if I saw that practicing happening in my team now. So it's about making sure that culture is right. If I'm really honest, Jack, over the period of time, I always thought that culture was driven by top down. So it was always, we set the scene, we kind of make sure everybody is working collaboratively. We go and do what we need to do to achieve the greater aim. And to a degree, I think that's right. When I joined Grant Thornton, whilst we were one national team, there was very much a regional competition. We'll call it an unhealthy competition. And actually getting the team away from that unhealthy competition when I took over to being a national team took a lot of effort around culture. We spent a lot of time talking about why we wanted to be working together, what was good, how was it important that we, as a collective, were in a situation where actually our competition was external. It wasn't internal. How do we then make sure that those regional challenges, which I think you face when you've got sort of a national team where people are at different parts of the country, how do you ensure then that you're all aligned to those goals? Well, we went through quite a lot of sort of away days, just really focusing on how we want to work together, to a point we've now got a service line agreement about how we operate. And we're very much in that frame where we know what we're doing. We know what our aim is. We got our clients at the absolute heart of everything that we do, but then we also ensure that we look after our people. So it's definitely been a journey, the cultural piece. And I think I started this little segue with saying, I always thought it was a top-down element. Actually, what I continue to do is just really challenge myself as to whether that's right and whether we're getting to a position that the culture is right. And one of the things I've been listening to recently is just some of the self-help books out there around culture. One of those was actually, culture isn't defined by words, it isn't defined by agreement. Actually, it's defined with what do you let happen and get away with, and what are you not challenging. So it's actually that kind of physical stuff that happens on the ground. How do you ensure that A, you're aware of it, B, that you deal with it, and C, that it doesn't impact that wider culture of the team? But it's been a bit of an eye-opener, and by no means are we there yet in terms of ensuring that is particularly grounded throughout the whole team. But there is definitely a collective will from us all to ensure that we are operating the right way. Actually, we're all coming to work with our best selves, and we're giving everybody the opportunity to demonstrate what they can bring to the team. So culture is everything. I think for me, it's just an ever evolving position. And one of the key things I learned from that book again is that you never get there in terms of a perfect culture. It's always a journey. And we're still very much on that journey.
Yeah. I mean, if you could say then in like a few words what your ideal culture is, then what would you say it is? Because obviously you've given the example there of having your own work ripped up in front of you. So
Yeah.
let's just say we can categorize that as something like, I don't know, bullying or something like that, which you don't want in there. Like, how would you describe the culture that you want?
Yeah, I suppose I want a feedback rich culture. So I want people to be able to say whether something's not right, why it's not right, and what the impact that is on there. I want a culture that is open and honest. I want one that's working together. And we have to understand that, ultimately we're all human beings and we all want stuff for ourselves, but we can achieve that if we work together with a view of really sort of growing as a unit. So it's really, I think it's about that, just being open, honest, collaborative, feedback-rich culture, which is the key. Because ultimately, if we're honest about where we are really honest about where we are, then it gives us the opportunity to do something about that. That might be, we are a relatively inexperienced team when you look at sort of the age range of people within the team. So one of the things that we're doing as part of recruitment now is thinking about actually, is there a way we can added years of experience? Is there anybody out there that can help us? We've got somebody who used to be part of the team that is very much experienced in the type of work that we're doing. They're not with the firm, but we're using them as a bench in terms of using them as an extra resource if we need to bring them in. So we're just really using those kind of feelings about what's the team doing? What does it look like? What are our strengths? What are our weaknesses? What are opportunities? What are our threats? Using that element then to think, right, okay, how then do we plug some of those gaps? How do we tap into those opportunities? How can we go out as a team to say, do you know what, we're really strong as a unit? And that's one thing I think we absolutely are, is as a team, we're really strong.
Mm-hmm. So I know you said from that one book, then it sounds like it says in there that the culture is what you don't let people get away with, something like that. But I'm guessing there is a bit of a flip side, right? Because like, let's say that you see people being open and honest and working together well. Surely there's like an element of like praise or encouragement around those things as well. So is it a bit of a combination of the two, do you think, in reality?
Without a doubt. And I can only use that because as an example of actually kind of my thinking. I think, ultimately there's bits there that people don't get right, and that's always going to happen. But I think the focus of where we are is we're very much out there in terms of identifying what's going really well and actually probably not as good as we should be at celebrating some of those successes. So Louisa, who's a director in my team, and I spend a lot of time thinking about what is it that we can do to identify the really good stuff, make sure that the recognition is there. And we have a staff survey, and we always come out really well in terms of the recognition piece. And it's right, ultimately somebody has done a good bit of work. All we can do as human beings is congratulate them for it. And I think that's the kind of the ultimate piece for me is actually, it'd be easy just to get stuck in the whirlwind of work, continue just head down, delivering and delivering. Actually, sometimes we've got to stand back and say, do you know what? We did really well there, or you did really well. And you did really well because of, and giving that feedback. And that's what I mean by the cultural rich feedback, the rich feedback culture that we want to ensue is actually recognizing when people do stuff that's outstanding. And we do get that, and we do make sure that people are there. On the flip side of that, if something doesn't go right, we've got to be brave enough to be able to say that wasn't right for the following reasons and learn from it. And I think it takes a lot of vulnerability, I think, to be able to say as a collective, we want that open and honest feedback, because by using that, we're only going to get better as a collective. And unbelievably, that includes me, because I'm not perfect. Whilst I lead the team, I've made loads of mistakes in terms of how we've grown that team, what we're doing in terms of people, with some of the recruitment decisions. And I can only learn from either those mistakes, or for some people saying to me, hang on a second, this wasn't right because of the following reasons. So it's something that as the leader in a team have to make sure that I am practicing and being held accountable like everybody else. And I'll give you an example. This happened in a team meeting this week. We were talking about one of the things in the service line agreement, and my colleague picked up something I said that wasn't right, and they were a bit worried afterwards in terms of, sorry, I should have dealt with it a different way. I said, no, it's exactly right. We should be challenging it if it's not right, because ultimately we're all one team, and if I've got something wrong, which I'm going to, let's highlight it and identify ultimately that ability to be open and collaborative about how we want to grow this team. Because if we grow it as a collective, we're all going to celebrate the success of it.
Coming up in May 2025 and June 2025 are my next masterclasses for tax professionals that help tax professionals to improve crucial skills for working in tax. May 2025 is the next tax research masterclass, which helps tax professionals know how to find, use, and apply appropriate tax legislation, guidance, and case law. June 2025 is the next tax advice masterclass, which teaches tax professionals how to provide high-quality tax advice that clients value and which lead to referrals and repeat business. To grow or scale a tax team, you need highly skilled team members so that work can be spread out and completed to a high quality without needing lots of yours or other senior members' time in every single piece of work. The more work that can be delegated and spread out, the better. Both of these masterclasses will help with that. You can get further details by heading on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/masterclasses. But if you're interested in either of these masterclasses for multiple tax people in your firm or tax team, then I suggest we have a call where I can share more information, how you figure out if it actually would be beneficial for your firm or team. If you think it would be, we can talk about who would benefit, and we can also talk about how I could best work with you and help your firm and team. Yeah. Can we just have a quick chat about the service line agreement then? So, like, what is that, and I suppose what is it trying to achieve?
Yeah, we want to make sure that we're doing right by our clients. So when we look at some of our our pillars in terms of what we do as a firm, one of those is keeping the client at the heart of what we do. So it's simple things like if we get an email from a client, just to acknowledge that within 24 hours. Doesn't mean necessarily that we are going to provide them with all the answers within that 24-hour period, but actually we just acknowledge the client has issued something. And therefore we're just saying, thank you very much, we've got that. We'll come back to you by a certain date. And it's just putting some of those practices into black and white so that we all are aware of actually what our role is in terms of operating in a fairly slick way, because we all get busy. We all get to a position where our to-do lists tend to get quite creaking, and there is sometimes an ability to get to a position whereby you're firefighting and you're trying to deal with X, Y, and Z. By using that acknowledgement as a first place, actually what you're doing is you are acknowledging the client, and then you're giving them an indication of time frame of response.
Okay.
So it's little things that, some of the team have been doing forever that we've then used as a collective as to how do we get better, and then making sure that we're all held accountable to achieve that SLA process.
I suppose it's essentially then, I'm trying to use different words to explain it here to see that I've understood it, but almost like the level of service and making sure that that's maintained, basically. They're making sure it's good enough. So it's like almost some rules around making sure that these are what we need to do to make sure service is good.
Yeah, exactly that. And it's born out really from, we often ask clients for feedback. We get some really good responses, but actually it's about how do we get better? And we noticed on a few cases, certainly on a few where we might get a lot of information in, which then we have to spend a bit of time going through it and making sure that we understand it. There can be periods of time where the client doesn't necessarily feel that they are a priority. So it's just really kind of actually going to the client and saying, look, this is what we've done. This is what we're going to do next. And just formalizing some of those key bits of client management, just to say, look, we are thinking about you. We are doing the work for you. You might not be able to see it, but promise you that once you do see it, you'll understand the work that we've done.
Yeah.
So it's just really, again, just it's that communication piece to clients, because doing the work, we absolutely are, but we probably haven't been as good as we should be in just notifying the client of how we're progressing that work. So just a little bit of structure really to it, Jack, to say, got it, thank you, we're going to respond by this date. And we've got some sort of agreements within that document in terms of if something is complex or if something's really easy and straightforward. There's different timeframes in which we said that we would go back to the client by, but we don't necessarily tell the client that, but we've got it internally so that we can keep ourselves accountable for it.
Yeah, and that makes sense. And I suppose it's key really, isn't it? Because if it was just say you and 3 other people, then people would probably look up to you, say, and see what you were doing, and that was good, and they would probably like copy it, right? But the second you're in a different office and there's another manager versus another manager, and they've all got their different approaches, I suppose what good looks like could be different dependent on person. I suppose what you're trying to do is bring consistency to some extent then of what good looks like, so that regardless of whether you're involved in the client or this manager's involved in the client, everyone knows like pretty much what the same, you know what's going to happen basically without needing to, let's say, check up on people or micromanage or get involved when you might necessarily not need to, and that type of thing. So you know what's happening is correct and as it should be, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. And the beauty of it, again, going back to the sort of collaboration piece, this was driven by the team. Ultimately, this was, we want to kind of deliver on something we think that could be an issue, how we kind of make sure that our clients are aware that we're thinking about them all the time. So we sat down as a group and thought about what are the key things. If you were the client, what would you want? And so we came up then with a list of those things, and it was quite a big list. And we really had to focus that down into something that's really simple and straightforward for a new person entering the team to understand. This is the expectation. This is what we do. And this is why we effectively go beyond for our clients, because ultimately I got into the job that I'm doing now is to help people who've got themselves in a bit of trouble. And ultimately that's a bit I love about the work that I do. It is the ability to help people in a time of need.
Yeah. I think I quite like this idea actually, because I've done something similar in my team, but it started off me calling it the team rules, and it wasn't just client specific, but it's like certain things that people I think should do at certain points in time to make sure that the team's operating effectively. The senior manager that I hired recently and started in Jan basically said like rules makes it sound like you're in a school or something, and it might not land well. So we ended up changing it to team framework, but it's essentially the same thing, and I suppose it's setting that expectation a bit like what you have in terms of what good looks like and holding people accountable. And the reason I've done that as well is because I want the team to be able to grow. I don't want me to have to be involved in everything, and I don't want me to like get in the way and become the blocker, essentially. And I thought by setting that out, it would give people more freedom to act within that kind of framework and then know that what they're doing is okay, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely does, Jack. And you're right. Ultimately, when you sit amongst at the top, you can be the blocker, and it can become a bit of a bottleneck. For sort of the last 12 months, Louise and my team has been promoted to director, which has alleviated some of that challenge. But certainly the 12 months before that, I was the only one who could sign stuff out the door, and then had to do managing that whole kind of piece around winning the work, making sure all the internal ethical stuff is up to date, and actually having other people within the team to be able to ensure that kind of works. And then we got different areas that we can focus on. But it was then, how does that flow down to the rest of the team? What's their responsibilities for it? When it's interesting in terms of the name of it, I think we've talked about team charters, we've talked about SLAs, I don't think we ever used rules, but effectively that it's just an acknowledgement of that's what we want to achieve. Yeah. And if we do that, we're going to look after clients, which is ultimately what we're all in it for.
Yeah. And you know what, actually on the name point, like I did get hung up on the name for like an awful long time. And
yeah,
particularly when I want to start creating, say, processes and procedures and SOP is like, I think ultimately where I've got to now is the name doesn't matter, because you might as well just get something in there that's doing what you want it to do. And the name ultimately doesn't really matter, because the name's not going to allow people to know what it's on about anyway until they look at it ultimately, right? So it kind of becomes a bit pointless anyway.
Yeah, and I know, like we do quite a bit of work around sort of understanding our personal traits in terms of our called it our insight profile. And I'm not very process driven in that way. It doesn't come natural to me. When you look at the kind of the wider things, I'm more of a green yellow in terms of insights. Insights, for everybody listening, effectively looks at your characteristic and gives you some indications of how you can work with other people in your team who might be a different color to you are. Louisa is very blue in terms of her analytical process. So it's actually tapping into other people's strengths to be able to help the team develop on this stuff. And there's everybody within the team that's got different kind of strengths that can add into that process. So you're absolutely right. You can get hung up on the names of things, but ultimately we wanted something that we could say that we're going to be accountable to deliver for clients, and it's working really well.
Yeah, that's good to hear. I mean, just very briefly then, on I suppose just to wrap up around growing and scaling, because I think particularly in professional services firms where ultimately what you provide is a service, and people need to provide that service. Like I think it's intrinsically hard to scale because ultimately it depends on having the right people, right? But
yeah,
like, what would you say your advice is then to be able to scale a team and make it grow and get bigger? Like, what would you say the key things are to do that from your experience?
Yeah, I think creating the right culture, is key, and I don't think it'd be a surprise for you to understand. That's how I feel around it. I think kind of giving everybody the opportunity to get involved in that plan. Sometimes it can feel a bit scary as leaders. Certainly when I first started, to sort of say, "Look, this is our plan. Let's get it something there," because there's intrinsically always something in me that felt quite vulnerable on that basis. To say, well, what if someone says, but it's not his plan or it's not their plan because it's all mine and they're my ideas, and you can get into situations which then becomes quite difficult. But actually, we've all got to be able to buy into that plan. Otherwise, it just doesn't work. And my team will know that we have a rowing boat analogy that we talk about every time we get together, which is we want everybody in the boat to be rowing in the same direction, and ultimately in time, because we'll go quicker to where we need to get to. It's that, I suppose, the cultural element, which I think is important. Also, kind of making sure that you have a sort of a diverse team that is really good in terms of thought, in terms of experiences, in terms of background. Because using different people's strengths and weaknesses will get to a position where you're going to be collectively better, quicker. What else do I think is important to that growth aspect? Having clearly defined goals, I think, both from a team business plan perspective, but actually then how do the team tap into that to be able to help the collective grow to where they want to go to. So it's really having that thought process first, and the ability to sit down and reflect then on what worked well on that plan, what needs to change, or what do you need to do more of. And it's a bit there that I think that we've certainly learned over the period of time. It's when stuff's going really well, how do we then really grow? How do we ensure that we do more of what we said we're going to do? Because by that, we're going to get more opportunities. And the final bit, I think, in it, Jack, is really to try and have a bit of fun along the way. You know, it can be really stressful in the professional services world, but it's important that ultimately we are operating as a team, almost as a family. One of the things I'm really keen on is to get together face to face and actually spend a bit of time getting to know each other, especially because we're not all centered in one location. That has its challenges, certainly around travel and subsistence budgets and all that other. But lockdown was a real treat for us in that actually we got together once a week as a team virtually, and we've just kept that going because we can have a conversation with a bit about team dynamics, but then it's also about what we're seeing and how we can build on it. So it's really one of those. It's being setting the scene, helping people along the way, it's making people understand what their roles are in setting that scene, and then just really going through it, but within a fun dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds a bit twee.
It does, yeah. I mean,
but...
well, the only other thing I suppose got a question on in relation to scaling is because obviously it's all well and good having more people in the team, etc. But ultimately, you need enough work coming in, and I think that can be probably one of the, or if not the biggest challenge is making sure where the work comes from. So how do you kind of like make sure that happens? Because is the full responsibility on that for you? Do you have other people in the team that are doing activity to win work too? Like, do you spread it out? Like, how do you do that to allow the team to scale?
Yeah, and it's got to be about leverage. So for me, at the top, when I talk about leverage, it's making sure I've got enough time to think about where new work is coming from, put the actions that we talk about in those business plan, and using that as then a basis to be able to go out and win new work, go into the different channels that we might be looking at and having that activity. I've felt myself at lots of times where I've looked at my diary and I'm back to back pretty much from 9 o'clock through to 5 o'clock. I have an external coach who effectively keeps me grounded in terms of actually what is my role here. My role here is to help grow this business, grow the team. I can't do that if I'm stuck in meetings from 9 till 5 o'clock. So his challenge to me was very much actually, where's your focus time? How do you ensure that you can have those thoughts processes, that you can do what you need to do in terms of growing this business? So I've had to be disciplined to a position where actually really focused about what I want to do, how I want to do it, and why I want to do it. And then making sure then that I free up other people in the team who want to do that ability to grow out and win some work. So we have a plan. We have a plan about going to see other people in different parts of the business. How do we then make sure that our associate director has got sufficient time to be able to do that? Are we targeting them correctly? How do we make sure that we're giving them the tools to spread the word of what we're doing? So it's really about trying to make sure that we're making best use of the time that we have available to then really focus on growth. How do we make sure that we're going to get work coming in? Historically, I was the work winner for the team. That was brilliant for me in going out and winning the work, but ultimately it just created a position where we were never really going to grow beyond the capacity that I would have. Louise has come in, she's helped develop that. So we've now kind of making sure that we're growing together and we've got more opportunities. But realistically, we want every level to have relationships with the other people in the firm or sometimes externally, and have that focus around just making sure we're having conversations, building relationships, and identifying opportunity. Because if everybody's got that in terms of their outlook, actually collectively, it takes 10% from everybody to get to a position where we've added significant revenue to the top and bottom lines.
Yeah.
So it's really just about making sure that we're having the ability to stand back and thinking, how do we go out and win that work? What is it we need to do? What's our route to market? How do we then get the best people internally and externally to be able to tap into that?
Yeah, interesting. Because I think I've since being a director in it, I've been consciously aware that like if I'm the only person that's winning work, then it's kind of as you said, like as soon as my time's filled up and there's a limit on how much work can be won if it's always me, right? So I always wanted to have other people in the team being at least involved to some extent. So obviously like senior managers, it makes more sense to get them involved, right? But what about like the most junior people in the team? How can they contribute to some extent? And the main thing that I've ended up doing in my team now is like every time we get an internal referral, so I appreciate it's a little bit different in my team that like is employment tax, and we can give advice on employment tax. Like we don't need a HMRC inquiry, right, for us to be able to give a client support. So every time we get an internal query or someone asking for support, like we don't just go back on that and see if we can help them with that. Like in the team now, what everyone has to do is basically the second that happens is before we talk to the client, we actually look at like the size of them, we look at like the profile of them a little bit, so then we can decide like, well, what things could end up being useful for them. So then when we go into that first meeting, there's a bunch of things that we can talk about with them. And so anyone in the team can do that, right? So it makes sense to, at the first instance, I think, to put that at the most junior person that's capable of doing it, because then it frees up the time of the more senior people. So that's one thing I brought in, for example, but I think I've still got some work to do with like more direction for, say, the more, say, targeted, proactive BD that'll end up being done by, say, me and some other senior people in the team.
Yeah, and we faced that really from the early stages, very similar. But you want those junior people to be your work winners of the future. So you need to give them the opportunity then to go out and do that. There's lots of sort of young professional networking events certainly in the Midlands that people can tap into, really keen for them to go out and build their own relationships, because in 5 or 6 years' time, you know, their fellow associates might be the sort of senior associate at a law firm or elsewhere that then will generate opportunities. So we've always been keen to ensure that people are brought along in terms of that business development kind of journey. But you're absolutely right. It's about actually how can you give them a bit of responsibility so they understand what we're trying to do, why we're trying to do it, and ultimately at the end of it, get to a position where that 1 + 1 = 5 or 6 because we're getting some really good outcomes from it. But it's a constantly changing landscape and journey, and you learn along the way, which is the bit that keeps me going.
Yeah, same. So shall we, just as one final bit to kind of talk about then, should we just talk a little bit about your kind of leadership philosophies then? Because I think that's equally going to be important, I think, in scaling a team, because if everyone looks at the leader and they really dislike them and they don't agree with what they're doing, scaling is not going to happen, which I suppose links into the culture piece to some extent anyway. So there's a bit of overlap, right? But what would you say your leadership philosophies are then? Like, how do you approach being a leader of the team?
Yeah, for me, it's about being there in case things go wrong and then celebrating successes for the rest of the team. So it's making sure that if mistakes happen, and they do happen, it's really kind of making sure that my response to it is such a way that people then can keep coming forward with any mistakes that they make so that actually we can do something about it. So I think it's an element really of making sure that you're approachable, that people can come to you with stuff and can come with either problems, hopefully with some solutions for those problems. But also making sure then again there's recognition for good job and there. So it's being visible and available. But again, my external coach has always challenged me as to ultimately, Dave, is it for you? Is it about being likable or is it being respected? And there's definitely been periods in my career where I've definitely had more to the let's be liked. And actually, kind of over the period of time now, it's about actually making sure that decisions are made for the best of the business. And then how do we make sure those decisions are ultimately then communicated to the team and making sure that everybody's aware of the reasoning behind it and even allowing some challenges along the way. So for me, being a good leader is all about listening to the team, listening to what they're saying and the feedback they're providing support, providing the vision and a direction of where we're going and the reasons why we're doing it, but also then making sure that we are being held accountable for the decisions and actions that we're doing. And that often can come in conflict in terms with making sure we're winning enough work, making sure that the team is meeting the client deadlines, and suddenly you've got lots of things that you need to keep an eye out. But you hire really intelligent people because they're really highly intelligent. So it's about trust and making sure then that the people that you're bringing in are going to operate the way that you want them to, and then link to our service line agreement, team charter, and link to actually helping achieve the direction and ambition of the team.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, just one question actually about what you said towards the beginning of that kind of answer is because I agree when people make mistakes, by the way, absolutely like allow them to come to you and make them realize that, mistakes are okay and part of the learning process, etc. But aim to minimize them. Where do you stand where someone like is constantly making mistakes and errors then? Because for me, there's got to be a line somewhere, right, where it starts becoming unacceptable. Like where does that sit for you, do you think?
Yeah, and you've got to when you first identify the problem, you've got to get the solution. You do that, and then you go back and you do the feedback element in terms of, why did it happen? What have you learned? What are you going to ensure you put in place for future? And if you don't then see any direction of travel and the same mistake keeps happening, then you have to get to a position where you're into performance improvement territory. And then you have to actively monitor them and you have to give people the opportunity to show that they can develop. But if they can't, and you have to get to a position ultimately which says they're not right for your business, going back to the point that we talked about keeping people, our clients at the heart of everything we do, we have to then make some tough decisions. And when you make those tough decisions, personally, it's not great. You have to, you do take some kind of personal reflection on it because ultimately I always feel that I haven't necessarily been able to help that person along the way, the journey, but it's a two-way street, Jack. So you have to be invested into where we're going and then work on your own personal development if there are things there that need to be doing that aren't being done. So there's always that element that ultimately we're there to serve clients and satisfy their needs. And if we're not doing that and people are making the same mistake, then naturally we have to go down the route of actually challenging poor behavior. Because if you don't, going back to culture and what you allow to get away with, actually it brings everybody else down. Why would I do this if if that person is just continually getting away with rubbish work?
Yeah. And I suppose it's not about, is it like that person's constantly doing rubbish work, let's rip up their work in front of them. You don't need to be like nasty about it. Let's say you can deal with it in a nice way still. But yeah, I I fully agree with you because I think as soon as you let one person get away with something that you consider unacceptable, then I think it brings the standards down for the full team because they suddenly go, well, that person's getting away with that. Maybe I can get away with that too, type thing. So I think, you've got to get rid of the bad apple, haven't you? I suppose before it harms everyone else sometimes.
Absolutely. And that's where we got to the analogy of the boat is ultimately we only want people in the boat that want to get us to the destination that we want to get to. There's no point in having 2 or 3 people swimming away and going in the wrong direction, because all it does is brings everybody else's fatigue down. And it is about challenging that poor behavior. And it's almost going back to that book that I mentioned earlier on, which I probably should remember the name of, but it escapes me. Ultimately, it does talk about the bits that you let get away, then become the culture, which then does mean that your high performers are like, what's the point? Ultimately, what's the point? Because you're allowing that behavior there when all I want to do is just be excellent and excel.
Yeah. So you just got to the point now then where obviously the team's already grown to some extent, and you alluded to earlier the fact that you want to actually continue growing it then. What would you say like the current plan is then to do that? Because you're already a sizable team, and I think to get it to that next level is probably going to be pretty difficult, right? And you probably already had some challenges in relation to that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And where we've got to get to is the step change now. So we've got a really good team. We're in a really good place in terms of our numbers, but actually now is the point and the opportunity, certainly with a more active HMRC, is about actually getting some more senior people in that can really help and drive and deliver that new work stream and actually make a difference in terms of taking where we are now, which is a really good team, to that great actually of being challenging some of the market leaders in what we do. We don't want to copy necessarily some of the market leaders that are out there, but there's definitely bits that we can borrow and pinch in terms of really driving that. And one of the kind of the business plans that we're dealing with at the moment, we've identified some areas whereby we're good at something, but by doing a few bit as extras, we could be really good or really great. And that's coming to fruition. So I think it is people now, Jack, in terms of how we really grow this business. We need some additional senior leadership to really kind of make that step change.
Yeah.
But that then gives the opportunity for the rest of the team to learn from someone new and get some more experience from them. And we've got some excellent juniors that are really going to make a difference because of where they want to get to in their career. So it's about making sure that whilst the focus is on bringing in excellent talent and bringing in really interesting work, actually, how are we challenging the really good members that we've got in the team? How do we ensure that we give them what they want? So it goes back to that listening, that trust, that collaboration piece that we've got with the team. Tell us where you want to get to. How can I help you get there? And what is it I can do ultimately that will make sure that you achieve that? Because if you do, collectively, we're going to achieve much more.
Yeah. Yeah. I suppose really the way I like to think about it, I think when you get to a certain size, it's a bit like starting a small business from scratch as an entrepreneur. When you first start that business, you're like responsible for everything really. And I suppose you'll always maintain ultimate responsibility for a lot of things, but you can start delegating out some of those responsibilities. So at some point you'll get an FD on board to look after the finances. At some point you'll bring on board a head of HR to look after the people side of things. And I suppose to some extent, that's probably what you're getting to now, right? And getting people to kind of head up different, almost subsections of the team now. So then you will be less involved in, say, that bit and maybe sit over it as a whole, but more high level sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That's it.
Where are the best places for people to go then, Dave, if they want to get in contact or learn more about you?
So I'm my LinkedIn. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn, so please do jump on board there. I am on various different social medias. I think I'm at Tax Disputes on what is now X and not Twitter. But I'm there. If anybody wants to chat about anything, please do send me a message, let a connection. More than happy to have a chat. One of the things I love most about my role or my position, my career is really to help people, both clients and employees or whoever. It's really just there to say, look, more than happy to have a conversation with anybody, really.
From my conversation with Dave, I would say the following are the key elements to growing and scaling a tax team. First thing, culture. Get the right culture in the team and protect it. 2, people. So you need to have good people to grow a tax team. They really will be the backbone to growing the team. 3, defining what good looks like. And in David's case, this is the service level agreement that he refers to throughout. And in my case, this is the team framework that I've created. Both of these make expectations clear. They create consistency and mean that regardless of who's undertaking the actions, that quality is maintained. But it's super important for directors and partners to not be the blocker and be involved in everything, and both of these help with that a lot. 4, make sure that you have someone who's responsible for leading the team and that they are actually doing this. So leading is different to managing, and managing is different to being the doer. So you need to make sure that someone is actually acting as a leader, because without a leader, you'll find it hard to grow and to scale. Show notes for this episode can be accessed at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP116. They include all the links mentioned throughout this episode, including links to my masterclasses for tax professionals, and also my contact details and David's contact details. And if you're interested in any dispute resolution support with HMRC, please do consider contacting David and his team. If you enjoyed this episode, you can sign up for email notifications of all future episodes by heading on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/subscribe. Emails are released bi-weekly and are released on Mondays. But that's it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed the episode and have taken away some useful points to help you to progress, develop, and improve your tax career. Until next time.